Hi everyone, welcome to Art and Anxiety. Today we're continuing our coffee shop kit customization. Now in the last video we built the foundation and the floor, and if we continue with the directions, our next step is the walls. The kit comes with this really lovely flowered wallpaper that I think my grandma actually had in her bathroom back in the 80s. Now I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever actually seen this type of wallpaper in a coffee shop, so we're going to toss it. Instead, I was thinking about a partially exposed brick wall that would look a little bit more modern for the scene that I'm going to set in my shop. Since I'm going to be adding texture to the walls, which is going to add thickness, I wanted to make sure that the walls would still glue together correctly when I was done. So I marked off the line where they fit together and then taped that off with some painter's tape. After I got them taped off, I went ahead and base coated all of the interior walls, and I'm keeping to the same colors that I used in the floor of the kit, so I'm basing with CraftSmart Ivory Paint. I'm going to be adding texture to get a rough cement or stuccoed look, and I'm going to use joint compound to do that. Now, I had the brilliant idea of adding my paint into the joint compound, thinking that I'd save a step. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a brilliant idea. It was in fact going to come back to haunt me. So did you know that joint compound is white, and that when you add white to your paint, it makes it a much lighter color? Yeah, you knew this? You're officially smarter than me, because when I had my brilliant idea, I forgot that little fact. But let's carry on. To apply the joint compound, I just troweled it onto the wall pieces roughly, and then I went over it with a natural sponge to give it some texture. Now, when you do this, be sure to keep all of the holes that later you're going to use to run wires or other components through clear the spackle. You can just poke it out with a toothpick or something like that if you need to. While my layer of spackle was drying, I went ahead and used my computer skills to make a brick stencil. I cut it out of acetate so that I'll be able to reuse it for future projects. And I'm going to provide a link to the graphic that I used in the description box below. But if you don't want to cut it out, you can also buy stencils just like this in the paper crafting section of your local craft store. I placed my stencil over two of the walls because I want the bricks to actually span the corner of the shop, and then I went ahead and taped it down. Now, if I was as smart as I thought I was that day, I would have taped off any of the bricks that I wasn't planning on placing on my wall, but I was just brimming with overconfidence that day and thought that I could handle it without the tape. I again, stupidly, colored my spackle with the reds and browns that I used for the floor, and then I spread it over the stencil. I used a wet sea sponge to sponge a little brick texture into the spackle and then pulled the stencil off while it was still wet. I did that to prevent it from cracking, which could happen if you pulled it off while it was dry. Then any mistakes that you made, the bricks that you didn't tape off that you should have, can be cleaned off with a wet sponge, provided you didn't color it brick red, in which case it will stain everything it touches. And right about now is when I started to regret my life's choices. I went and tried painting over my mistakes and realized just how much lighter my walls were than my paint color. I went ahead and added a bunch of white to my paint, and it was still too dark. And I thought to myself, it's okay. When I use the black wash over everything, it's gonna hide it anyway. I was so optimistic. Since I realized the whole spackle paint mistake I made, I also noticed that my bricks were pink. So I took my stencil and placed it back over the bricks and just sponged that chocolate brown and red brick paint over them to make them look a little more brick-like. Then, once I'd repainted the bricks, I went over the whole thing with my watered down black wash. And if you listen closely, you can hear my heart stop beating when I realized what was happening. Here's the thing. I added my paint to the spackle, so I didn't go back and paint over it to seal it because it was already the color that I was trying to make it, or supposedly. So when I put the wash on, it just soaked into the joint compound. I tried pulling it back off with a paper towel, but it soaked in as soon as the brush touched that joint compound. I went back over it when I was done, tried to lighten it up with a little bit of dry brushing, but it did not help. Now, if I was making an abandoned coffee shop, this would be the perfect look, but that isn't my plan. So I slept on it. And the next morning, I took a good look at it and decided there was nothing to be done. There was no helping what I had done to these walls. So I painted over them with the suede colored CraftSmart paint and just started again. I wasn't back to square one because the texture was already there, but I was definitely back to square two. So I just plopped my stencil over the brick textured area and then again sponged my brick colors over it in layers. I started with the chocolate brown, then the red brick, a little bit of the suede that I'm using in the other wall color for highlights, and then I peeled off my stencil and moved to the wall part. Over that base suede wall color, I sponged some taupe and then went over again and sponged some ivory, and then I blended it all out with a little bit of a sponged on coat of that base color, that suede color again. And by topping it off with a lightly sponged layer of the same based color, it prevents it from looking like the sponge painted walls that were popular on the sets of sci-fi TV series back in the 90s. And it just makes it look like texture on the walls instead of a paint job. And bonus points if you know the series I'm talking about. Let me know in the comments what your guess is. Once I had the walls painted again, I held my breath. I found a somewhat hidden spot and touched the black wash to the wall to see what it was going to do. And it worked this time. That layer of paint just makes all the difference when it comes to using paint washes. So now that I knew it was going to work like it was supposed to, I gave the whole thing a coat of black wash just to add some depth of color. And then I went back and did another coat, but just in the mortar areas between the bricks this time. Any spots where the wash left a harsh line when it dried, I went back over it with just a brush filled with plain water and used that to blend out those lines. I wanted to paint the outside of the coffee shop as well. And originally I was going to add some texture to them, but at this point things were actually going well and I didn't want to push my luck any further. So I decided to just paint it. I did want to seal the glue lines with some spackle though, so it actually looked like a stuccoed building. So I glued the walls together before moving on to the next step. And while the glue was drying, I went ahead and glued the trellis fence together that goes on the side of the building by the seating area. To fill the seams on the back of the building, I just rubbed some joint compound into the seam with my finger, and then once it had dried, I sanded it smooth. I painted the back of the building the exact same way I painted the interior. I basted it in suede. I sponged on some taupe, some ivory, and then another light sponge coat of suede before giving everything a tentative coat of blackwash. Once the paint on the back of the building had completely dried, I glued in the windows and their frames. Now, that little window opening on the back wall was cut just a little too small for the frame, so I really had to work it in there, but I was able to muscle it in without having to alter the opening. The frame for the larger window sits a little oddly in the opening. So if you have a problem getting your pieces to line up, just use a glue that grabs a little bit slower so you have some time to slide the pieces around into a position that looks good to you. Next, it was time to glue the walls onto the base. And I love my 1, 2, 3 blocks for this. I actually have 6 sets of them because I mentioned to my husband that I needed another set and he bought me a case. But they really come in handy. They are good for weights and clamps and making sure you have the correct 90-degree angles. And if you don't have a set, you should really consider the investment because for me, they are one of the top tools on my list of essentials for dollhouse construction. And then after I glued the walls on, I went ahead and glued that little fence to the side of the building and then just left everything to dry. Do you remember what our kit walls were supposed to look like? This is a lot better, right? It's much more modern, I think, than that terrible flowered grandma wallpaper. So, what's the lesson from this part of the build? Well, don't mix your paint with your spackle unless you really want pastel pink bricks. And never expect things to go the way you think they're going to. I told you a few weeks ago that I am going to show you my imperfect process. So when things go wrong, you know you can fix it. So here I am, proving that I do stupid things so you don't have to. But it turned out well though. I like it. I made some new plans for what to do with the back of the building, and I think it's all coming together really well. I'm happy. The next step in our instructions is the wiring. So in next week's video, I'll be showing you how to do that and also how to put in a better switch because the kit placement is just dumb. So if potentially watching me electrocute myself sounds like fun to you, be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you'll be notified when that video goes live. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and until next time, stay sane.